I am Maya, 32 years old, and until today, I thought I was flying back to Atlanta just to finalize my divorce and let my arrogant husband think he had won. But when I helped an elderly man having a medical emergency on my flight, I had no idea this quiet stranger was about to walk into the courthouse and make my powerful narcissistic husband drop to his knees in pure terror. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a partner who severely underestimated your worth. The seatbelt sign chimed softly overhead as I settled into my first-class window seat on the flight to Atlanta. I leaned my head against the cool glass, hoping to find just an hour of peace before the inevitable storm waiting for me on the ground. But peace was a luxury my husband never allowed me to have. My phone vibrated intensely against my palm. The screen lit up with a text message from Terrence. Sign the $20,000 settlement today, or I leave you with nothing. My firm's partners are golfing with the judge this weekend. Know your place. I stared at those 3 words. Know your place. It was the exact phrase he had used throughout our entire 3-year marriage to keep me contained. Terrence was a junior partner at a top-tier Atlanta law firm, a man who thrived on control status and superiority. He genuinely believed that because I grew up on the South Side with a working-class mother, I should bow down in eternal gratitude for his generational wealth and high society connections. He loved the optics of being my savior, while quietly demanding I shrink myself to fit his fragile ego. I did not type a furious response. I did not cry. Crying over Terrence was a habit I had broken months ago. I simply swiped left on the screen and deleted the message completely. I reached over with my right hand and calmly adjusted my Rolex. It was a heavy, beautiful timepiece one I had purchased for myself with my own money after closing my first major corporate contract. Of course, Terrence loved telling his country club friends that he had gifted it to me to celebrate our anniversary. He was obsessed with painting me as his dependent, refusing to acknowledge the reality of my life. He dismissed my career as a cute party planning hustle. In truth, I was the founder and CEO of Apex Crisis Management, a multi-million-dollar corporate auditing and public relations firm. I cleaned up the messes of Fortune 500 companies. I handled hostile boardrooms and panicked executives for a living. Terrence had no idea about my actual net worth or the titanium corporate card sitting in my wallet, and I was perfectly fine letting him remain in the dark until the time was right. I turned my attention away from the digital threats and looked at the man sitting in the aisle seat next to me. He was an older African-American gentleman, perhaps, in his mid-70s, wearing a sharp but unassuming tweed suit. His name was Harrison, and we had exchanged brief, polite nods when we boarded the aircraft. He had been quietly reading a heavy hardcover book, minding his own business. Suddenly, his breathing grew shallow and ragged. I watched his chest heave as he dropped his book and began patting his pockets with trembling hands. The sharp, terrifying wheezing sound of a severe asthma attack filled the quiet first-class cabin. He was gasping for air, his eyes widening in pure panic as he fumbled wildly through his leather carry-on bag at his feet. Across the aisle, a woman with perfectly blown-out blonde hair and a designer silk scarf draped over her shoulders let out a loud theatrical sigh. She rolled her eyes and aggressively snapped her fingers at a passing flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with extreme entitlement. "Could you please do something about this commotion right now? I paid a premium for a first-class ticket to relax, and this man panicking over whatever is wrong with him is completely ruining my champagne experience. Can you move him to the back where he belongs?" The sheer audacity of her complaint, the absolute lack of basic human empathy, ignited a cold and precise anger deep in my chest. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up, leaning slightly across the aisle. I did not yell. I did not lose my temper. You do not build a successful crisis management firm by losing your cool. I looked dead into her eyes and utilized the exact tone I reserved for dealing with hostile corporate bullies. "Ma'am," I said, my voice cold and razor-sharp, "unless you have a medical degree tucked inside that overpriced and clearly out-of-season handbag, I strongly suggest you close your mouth, face forward, and drink your champagne in total silence. If you say one more word while this man is struggling to breathe, I will personally make your lack of basic human decency my top public relations project for the day, and I promise you will go viral for all the wrong reasons before we even touch down in Georgia." She gasped, her face flushing a deep crimson red, and sank back into her leather seat without uttering another syllable. Having neutralized the immediate distraction, I turned my full focus back to Harrison. I crouched in the narrow space beside his seat. The flight attendant was already rushing down the aisle with an emergency medical kit, but I had spotted the edge of a blue prescription inhaler caught in the frayed lining of his leather bag. I pulled it out swiftly, shook it, and placed it firmly into his trembling hand. "Breathe with me," I instructed, keeping my tone steady, grounded, and highly authoritative. "Look right at my eyes, Harrison. You are safe. Inhale right now." I counted out loud, coaching his breathing pattern, creating a focused bubble of calm around us, amidst the hum of the jet engines. I placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, letting him know he was not alone in his panic. Slowly, agonizingly, the harsh wheezing began to subside. The color returned to his face, and his chest stopped heaving so violently. The medical team arrived, checked his vitals, and confirmed his oxygen levels were stabilizing. Harrison leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes in profound relief as he took his first deep, unhindered breath. Once I was certain he was completely safe, I sat back down in my window seat, smoothed the skirt of my tailored suit, and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents I needed to review before landing. The settlement papers Terrence had drawn up were laughable, an insulting attempt to leave me with a fraction of what I had actually contributed to our household. I took out my pen and began making notes in the margins, preparing my strategy for the courtroom. Harrison caught his breath, adjusted his tweed jacket, and opened his eyes. He turned his head and glanced at the heavy stack of papers resting on my tray table. "Divorce?" he asked softly, his voice still a bit raspy, but carrying a surprising warmth and intelligence. I nodded, not wanting to burden him with the toxic reality of my life, but feeling a strange, unspoken kinship after the intense moment we had just shared. "Yes," I mentioned casually, keeping my eyes on the paperwork. "I am heading into court today against a bully of a lawyer. He thinks he owns the entire city of Atlanta, and he is determined to leave me with absolutely nothing just to prove a point about his power." Harrison shifted in his seat and looked down at the top page of my documents, his gaze lingering on the name of the law firm printed on the letterhead. A quiet, incredibly dangerous smile spread across his face, transforming his frail, elderly appearance into something profoundly authoritative and sharp. "I used to teach law," he said, his eyes gleaming with a sudden brilliant intensity. "I know a thing or two about men who think they run the world. Mind if I tag along to the courthouse with you today? I love watching arrogant attorneys dig their own graves." The cabin pressure shifted, popping my ears as the aircraft began its initial descent through the thick Georgia clouds. The sudden change in altitude did nothing to break the heavy silence between me and the man sitting in the aisle seat. Harrison folded his hands over his lap, the sheer panic from his earlier asthma attack completely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp focus that seemed to cut right through the dim lighting of the first-class cabin. He glanced down at the thick stack of settlement papers resting on my tray table, his dark eyes analyzing the dense legal jargon with an ease that told me he was no stranger to a courtroom. "You handled that medical emergency with the ice-cold precision of a seasoned litigator," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "What kind of man thinks he can bully a woman who does not even flinch when a stranger stops breathing next to her?" I did not offer him a tearful sob story about a broken marriage or a wasted youth. Tears were a useless expenditure of hydration, and I had stopped crying over Terrence exactly 6 months ago when the financial discrepancies first appeared. Instead, I gave Harrison raw, unfiltered data. "A man who mistakes my silence for submission," I replied, squaring my shoulders against the leather seat. "He is a junior partner at one of the most ruthless law firms in Atlanta. He built his entire identity on the illusion of control. Right now, he genuinely believes he has cornered me into signing away my rights to our marital assets. He thinks I am just a simple event planner from the South Side who will be too intimidated by his expensive suits and legal threats to look under the hood of his finances." Terrence spent his entire life running from his roots, desperate to prove he belonged in the elite circles of Atlanta. His mother Brenda fueled that insecurity every single day, constantly whispering in his ear that I lacked the pedigree required for a future senior partner. Harrison tilted his head, leaning slightly closer. And what exactly is under the hood? $2.4 million, I stated flatly, not missing a beat. He systematically drained our joint investment accounts over the last year, funneling the capital into a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. He thought he was a financial genius for using his brother Jamal and his entitled wife Chloe to launder the transfers. Chloe used her whiteness and her family name as a weapon at every family dinner, constantly issuing backhanded compliments about my working-class background. All the while, she was secretly living off the money Terrence siphoned from my accounts to keep her husband's commercial real estate business afloat. Terrence routed the marital assets through their failing limited liability company disguised as private consulting fees. He assumed a party planner would never have the resources or the intellect to request a forensic audit of her brother-in-law's commercial leases. Harrison let out a low, rumbling chuckle that vibrated with genuine amusement. He adjusted his tweed jacket, looking at me with a newfound intense respect. "You certainly do not sound like a party planner, Maya. What is it that you actually do for a living?" I did not answer him with words. The flight attendant announced our final approach, but I had just enough time to demonstrate exactly who Terrence was attempting to destroy. I woke up my laptop screen, bypassing the security firewall with a swift entry of my administrative credentials. A highly classified federal corporate audit was open on my desktop, detailing the severe compliance violations of a major global supply chain conglomerate. With two precise keystrokes, I executed a digital signature that instantly froze their international assets pending a board restructure. I turned the laptop screen just slightly so Harrison could see the confirmation banner flash a bright, undeniable green across the display. "I clean up messes made by arrogant men," I told him, closing the laptop with a crisp, definitive snap. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Crisis Management. We handle the catastrophic public relations nightmares and corporate fraud scandals that men like my husband create behind closed doors. I do not plan parties. I dismantle failing empires and restructure them for profit." Harrison stared at the closed laptop, a look of profound realization settling over his features. Before he could respond, the wheels of the aircraft touched down on the Atlanta tarmac with a heavy grounding thud. The moment the plane slowed and my phone connected to the local cellular network, the device vibrated aggressively against the armrest. It was another message from Terrence. I swiped open the screen. This time it was not just a threat, it was a photograph. Terrence was sitting at a secluded corner table inside a Michelin star restaurant in Buckhead, holding up a crystal glass of expensive red wine, an insufferable, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. Sitting directly across from him, grinning wildly at the camera, was a light-skinned woman with a sleek, expensive blowout. She was wearing a stunning emerald green designer dress. I recognized the garment instantly. It was the exact dress Terrence had charged to my personal business credit card 3 months ago, claiming he needed to purchase a high-end gift for a female client to secure a major firm contract. The caption printed boldly below the photograph read, "Do not bother bringing a lawyer to the courthouse today. You cannot afford one anyway. Just sign the settlement papers and go back to your little party planning hustle. Let the real adults handle the business." A cold, calculated calm washed over my entire body. Terrence thought this image would break me. He thought rubbing his new Harvard-educated girlfriend in my face would shatter my confidence and send me walking into the Fulton County Courthouse as a weeping, broken woman ready to surrender. He was banking on my emotional collapse, completely unaware that I was stepping off this plane, ready to scorch his entire reality to ash. I was about to lock my phone screen when Harrison, who was gathering his leather carry-on bag from beneath the seat, glanced over my shoulder. He caught sight of the glowing image. He did not look away politely. He stared directly at the photograph, his eyes tracing the contours of Terrence's face. A flicker of deep, undeniable recognition crossed his dark eyes, followed immediately by a storm of cold, calculated outrage. I watched an incredible, chilling transformation take place right in front of me. The frail, vulnerable elderly man who had been gasping for breath just an hour ago completely vanished. His posture straightened dramatically, his shoulders squared, and an aura of absolute terrifying authority radiated from his presence. The shift was so sudden and powerful, it altered the very gravity of the space around us. He adjusted his tweed tie, his jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line as his eyes narrowed at the image of my husband. "Is that the junior partner you mentioned?" Harrison asked, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy, unmistakable weight of a man who was used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. "That is Terrence," I confirmed, slipping the phone into my designer blazer pocket. "The man who thinks he is untouchable." Harrison let out a slow, measured breath. He looked me directly in the eyes, and a slow, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I have not practiced inside a courtroom in years, Maya," he said, his tone resonating with quiet, absolute danger. "But for this, for a man who steals from his wife to fund his own arrogance, I will be your pro bono counsel today. Let us go break a lawyer." The landing gear hit the Atlanta tarmac with a heavy thud that rattled the cabin. I unbuckled my seatbelt the moment the sign blinked off, stepping into the humid Georgia air with Harrison right beside me. We navigated the sprawling concourses of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in a purposeful rhythm. I did not rush. Rushing indicated panic, and panic was exactly what Terrence was banking on. We bypassed the crowded baggage carousels and walked directly toward the elite executive transport lounge. The air conditioning in the terminal offered a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat waiting outside the sliding glass doors. I approached the sleek marble counter of the luxury car service kiosk. The attendant, a young man with a crisp uniform, smiled warmly and asked for my preferred vehicle and payment method. I requested a private town car to the Fulton County Courthouse and handed him the Platinum Joint credit card Terrence and I had shared for 3 years. The attendant swiped the card. The machine beeped a harsh, flat tone. He frowned, tried wiping the magnetic strip, and swiped it again. The same flat beep echoed across the marble counter. "Ma'am, I apologize," the attendant said, his voice dropping into a hushed, sympathetic tone. "The system is showing this account has been frozen by the primary cardholder. Do you have another form of payment?" I stared at the small digital screen flashing the word "declined" in bright red letters. Terrence had actually done it. While I was 30,000 feet in the air, he had contacted the bank and completely severed my access to our shared marital funds. It was a classic textbook move from a narcissistic abuser. He wanted to strand me at the busiest airport in the country with no cash, no transportation, and no leverage. He wanted me to experience the sheer terror of financial ruin, so that by the time I finally managed to drag myself to the courthouse, I would be begging him for a cab fare and a $20,000 settlement just to survive the week. I did not gasp. I did not flush with embarrassment or scramble to find an excuse for the attendant. I simply smiled, a cold, serene expression that caused the young man behind the counter to stand a little straighter. "My husband has a rather predictable flair for the dramatic," I told the attendant. "Please cancel the town car. I will take the Maybach instead." I reached into the inner zip compartment of my tailored blazer and pulled out a solid titanium black Centurion card. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and completely untraceable by Terrence. This account was tied exclusively to Apex Crisis Management, backed by the millions in retainer fees I commanded from auditing global corporations. Terrence had spent our entire marriage assuming my income barely covered groceries and my own wardrobe. He never knew I had built a fortress of autonomous wealth right under his nose. I placed the heavy metal card onto the marble counter with a solid, satisfying clink. The attendant stared at the black titanium for a fraction of a second before his entire demeanor shifted from sympathetic customer service to absolute deferential respect. He processed the transaction instantly. "Right this way, ma'am," he said, gesturing toward the VIP exit doors. "Your driver is pulling up to the private curb right now." I turned to look at Harrison. He was standing a few feet away, leaning casually on his wooden cane. He had watched the entire interaction unfold. He did not say a word, but his dark eyes gleamed with a sharp, approving intelligence. He raised one silver eyebrow, silently acknowledging the massive financial leverage I had just casually dropped onto the counter. He was beginning to understand that I was not a victim seeking a savior. I was an executioner gathering her tools. We walked out into the stifling Atlanta heat and settled into the expansive air-conditioned leather seats of the black Maybach. The heavy doors closed, shutting out the roar of the airport traffic completely. The driver offered us chilled, sparkling water before pulling seamlessly onto the highway, heading straight for downtown Atlanta. The ride to the courthouse started in absolute silence. I unclasped my briefcase and began spreading the heavily redacted financial disclosures Terrence had submitted to the court across the wide leather seat between me and Harrison. These were the documents Terrence planned to use to prove I was entirely dependent on him, painting himself as the sole financial provider for our household. Harrison adjusted his reading glasses and picked up the first stack of papers. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the luxury vehicle was the crisp turning of pages. I watched the retired professor transform back into a legal predator. His eyes darted across the columns of numbers, his mind calculating the exact statutes Terrence was blatantly violating. "This is incredibly sloppy work," Harrison finally said, his voice laced with professional disgust. "Your husband is arrogant, which makes him careless. He has completely omitted 3 separate investment portfolios and listed his current firm compensation at a fraction of the standard junior partner rate. But this section here," he tapped a manicured finger against a specific line item. "This continuous outflow of consulting fees to an external limited liability company. It is structured to look like standard operational expenses for his law firm." I nodded, pulling a second file from my briefcase. I handed it to Harrison. "That limited liability company belongs to his brother Jamal and his wife Chloe. Jamal runs a commercial real estate development firm that has been hemorrhaging money for 2 years. Chloe is a woman who grew up with old generational wealth that completely dried up before she even reached college, though she would rather die than admit it. She spends her days attending charity galas and issuing microaggressions about my hair and my South Side upbringing, completely oblivious to the fact that her designer lifestyle is currently funded by stolen money." Harrison reviewed the corporate filings I handed him. "Terrence is laundering your marital assets through his brother's failing business to hide the capital from the divorce proceedings. He intends to reclaim the funds once the judge finalizes your $20,000 settlement. This is not just a breach of fiduciary duty. This is perjury. If he submits this under oath today, he is committing a felony." I looked out the tinted window of the Maybach as the towering glass and steel structures of the Atlanta skyline came into view. "He is going to submit it," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Terrence cannot help himself. He needs to win, and he needs to humiliate me on public record to solidify his own ego. He believes his firm's senior partners have enough influence with the local judges to protect him from any genuine scrutiny. He thinks the system is rigged entirely in his favor." Harrison folded the documents perfectly and handed them back to me. He rested both hands on the smooth head of his wooden cane. "The system is only rigged for those who hold the keys, Maya. And today, your husband is going to learn that he does not even own the locks." The Maybach glided smoothly off the main avenue and turned onto the street, approaching the Fulton County Courthouse. The massive, imposing structure of granite and columns loomed ahead, a physical representation of the legal battleground where Terrence planned to execute my financial ruin. The driver pulled the vehicle slowly toward the designated drop-off zone near the grand staircase. I leaned forward, peering through the dark tinted glass of the passenger window. My pulse remained steady, but a cold, sharp energy coiled tight in my chest. There they were, standing right at the base of the courthouse steps. Blocking the path to the metal detectors was the welcoming committee. Terrence stood in the center, wearing a bespoke navy blue suit that cost more than my mother made in an entire year. I was checking his phone, a smug, relaxed posture, indicating he was likely waiting to see if I would call him, begging for a ride from the airport. To his right stood his mother, Brenda. She was dressed in an immaculate cream-colored pantsuit, her posture rigid and judging. She held a designer clutch with a white-knuckled grip, her face set in a permanent sneer of elitist disdain. She had spent the last 3 years reminding me that I was a charity case they had graciously allowed into their prestigious family. And to Terrence's left stood Chloe. She was wearing a pair of oversized sunglasses and a pastel dress that screamed old money aesthetic. She was holding a coffee cup, casually leaning against the stone railing, playing the part of the supportive, wealthy sister-in-law who was just there to witness the removal of the family embarrassment. They were positioned perfectly, a unified front of arrogance and entitlement waiting to ambush me, break my spirit, and force me into submission before I even stepped foot inside the legal arena. Harrison looked out the window, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of my husband and his family. He let out a soft, almost imperceptible scoff. "They look very confident for people standing on a trap door," Harrison said quietly. I unlatched the lock on my briefcase and secured the brass clasp. I smoothed my blazer, taking one deep, centering breath. "Let them enjoy the sunshine for a few more minutes," I replied, placing my hand on the door handle. "Because the moment we step out of this car, their entire world is going to cave in." The driver opened this heavy door of the Maybach. The oppressive Atlanta humidity hit me instantly, wrapping around me like a damp towel, but I kept my breathing perfectly even and my posture rigid. I stepped onto the pavement, the heels of my shoes clicking against the concrete with a definitive, unyielding purpose. Harrison slid out behind me. He leaned heavily on his polished wooden cane and checked the face of his gold pocket watch. "Give me just a moment, Maya," he said, his voice lowering into a conspiratorial, gravely register. "I need to make a quick phone call to ensure a few critical dominoes are perfectly aligned before we step inside. Do not let them see you sweat." I nodded, adjusting the sharp lapels of my tailored blazer. "I do not sweat, Harrison. I strategize." He smiled that dangerous, knowing smile again and stepped away toward a shaded alcove, pulling a sleek cell phone from his breast pocket. I turned to face the sweeping granite stairs of the Fulton County Courthouse. The massive stone pillars cast long, intimidating shadows over the plaza. I was entirely alone at the base of the steps, which was exactly the scenario Terrence had meticulously planned. He wanted me isolated. He wanted me vulnerable. Terrence stood near the top of the grand staircase, flanked by the two women who had made it their life mission to remind me I did not belong in their elevated social strata. They descended the stairs, slowly moving like a royal procession coming to inspect a peasant who had dared to trespass on their estate. Brenda led the charge. She wore a pristine cream-colored pantsuit and a heavy string of oversized pearls that clacked against her collarbone. Her face was twisted into a mask of absolute elitist disdain. She did not bother with a greeting or a shred of basic human decency. She never did. "I told Terrence not to marry a girl from the South Side, who could not even afford her own tuition," Brenda spat, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the passing lawyers and court clerks could hear her disrespect. "We brought you into our home. We gave you a name that actually means something in the city of Atlanta. We paid off your mother's medical debt so you would not embarrass us at the country club with your poverty, and this is how you repay us. You drag my brilliant son to court to steal what he worked so hard for." I looked at Brenda, feeling nothing but a clinical, icy detachment. For 3 years, I had allowed her to use my mother's illness as a leash to control my behavior. My mother had worked 2 jobs her entire life, and when her heart failed, Brenda had swooped in to cover the hospital bills. She loved reminding me of that transaction at every holiday dinner. She loved weaponizing her generational wealth to demand my total submission. What Brenda did not know was that I had anonymously reimbursed her trust account 2 years ago, paying back every single dime with interest using an untraceable cashier's check from my corporate firm. She thought she owned me through debt. She was about to find out she could not even afford to speak to me. Before I could verbally dissect Brenda's delusions, Chloe stepped forward, eagerly inserting herself into a family dynamic she fundamentally did not understand but absolutely loved to exploit. Chloe was the master of weaponized incompetence and fragile victimhood. As a white woman married into an affluent African-American family, she used her marriage to Terrence's brother Jamal as a shield to deliver constant venomous microaggressions without consequence. She clutched a beige designer handbag tightly against her chest, offering me a tight, heavily glossed, pitying smile. "Maya, sweetie," Chloe said, her tone dripping with fake, syrupy Southern hospitality. "You have to understand that this is really for the best. Terrence's new girlfriend is a Harvard lawyer. She just fits into our world so much better than a party planner ever could. You two were always a complete mismatch culturally and financially. Just take the $20,000 settlement Terrence is offering and go back to your little event business. It is a very generous offer for someone with your background. The sheer audacity of her statement hung heavy in the humid air. Terrence stood just behind them with his arms crossed over his bespoke navy suit. I was smirking like a king watching his loyal guards execute a traitor. He expected me to shatter into pieces right there on the concrete. He wanted me to cry, to beg, to feel the crushing, suffocating weight of their unified rejection. He needed my emotional collapse to feed his narcissistic supply. I did not cry, I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not lose my temper. Instead, a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. I looked Chloe up and down, letting my gaze travel over her carefully curated outfit before lingering deliberately on her beige handbag. "Chloe," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air with surgical precision. "You are carrying a Prada bag from 3 seasons ago, and the leather is visibly fraying at the seams. More importantly, your husband Jamal has had his trust fund overdrawn for 6 consecutive months." Chloe gasped, her fake smile instantly vanishing. I took a step closer, invading her personal space, projecting absolute authority. "I know this because the bank flagged the accounts when his checks started bouncing across the city." I continued, my tone flat and merciless. "Do not ever speak to me about wealth or fitting into your exclusive world when you and Jamal are exactly one missed mortgage payment away from moving back into your parents' basement. Your entire designer lifestyle is being funded by money your brother-in-law is currently stealing from my marital accounts." Chloe took a physical step backward, as if I had slapped her across the face. The smug superiority melted away, replaced by pale, breathless shock. She looked at Terrence wildly, searching for him to deny my claims, but Terrence was too stunned by my sudden revelation to offer her any cover. He had assumed his financial laundering through Jamal's failing real estate firm was a bulletproof secret. Hearing me state the facts out loud on the courthouse steps paralyzed him. Brenda's mouth opened in pure outrage. "How dare you speak to your sister-in-law that way?" Brenda shrieked, her pearls shaking against her chest. "You are a delusional, ungrateful liar." I did not give Brenda the oxygen to speak another sentence. I squared my shoulders, breaking their little human barricade. I brushed right past them, forcing Chloe to stumble out of my path as I climbed the granite steps toward the metal detectors with absolute unyielding authority. The sudden violent shift in power broke Terrence's carefully crafted facade. He could not stand being ignored. He could not process being dismissed and belittled by the woman he had sworn to destroy and leave destitute. His fragile ego snapped completely. Maya Terrence barked, his voice cracking with sudden uncontrolled rage. He lunged forward, abandoning his composed posture. He reached out aggressively, his hand shooting forward to grab my arm and physically force me to stop and face him. Terrence's fingers clamped around my forearm like a vice. His grip was bruising, frantic, completely stripping away the polished, untouchable junior partner facade he so carefully maintained for the Atlanta elite. With a sudden violent jerk, he shoved me backward until my shoulder blades hit the cold marble wall of the courthouse lobby. The unexpected impact knocked the breath from my lungs, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a gasp. I was trained to handle hostile corporate takeovers and aggressive boardroom bullies. Terrence was just another hostile entity losing his leverage, acting out of pure, unadulterated panic. A few feet away, Brenda stood watching her son assault me with a look of twisted pride on her face. She adjusted her pearls, her chin tilted upward, completely validating his aggression. In her warped, elitist mind, I was finally being put in my proper place. Beside her, Chloe clutched her frayed designer handbag, her pale face flushed with excitement. Chloe thrived on watching other people suffer to elevate her own fragile status, and seeing Terrence physically corner me gave her the exact validation she craved. They were a unified audience of toxicity cheering on their golden boy. Terrence leaned in uncomfortably close. I could smell the expensive, overpowering cologne he always wore to mask the stale coffee on his breath. He reached into his custom leather briefcase with his free hand and yanked out the $20,000 settlement papers. He shoved the crumpled document directly into my face, his eyes wild with a terrifying, unhinged rage that he usually kept hidden behind closed doors. He told me I had stepped entirely out of line. He said exposing his brother Jamal's financial ruin in front of his mother and his sister-in-law was the biggest mistake of my miserable, pathetic life. He reminded me that I was nothing but a ghetto girl from the South Side, playing dress-up in a corporate world I fundamentally did not understand. He genuinely believed his words were cutting me down to size, completely unaware that his anger was just a spectacular display of his own deep-seated insecurities. "Sign the paper right now." Maya Terrence hissed, his voice vibrating with venom, a dark vein pulsing against his temple. "If you dare walk into that courtroom and contest this divorce, I will personally see to it that your little party planning hustle is ground into dust. I will use every single connection I have at Caldwell and Associates to blacklist you across the entire state of Georgia. I will freeze your vendor accounts. I will bury you in frivolous litigation until you cannot even afford a cup of tap water. You will be out on the street begging for this $20,000. I am going to make you homeless." I maintained direct, unflinching eye contact, letting his threats wash over me like a light, insignificant rain. I slowly crossed my arms over my chest, shifting my wrist just a fraction of an inch. With a single undetectable tap of my index finger against the smooth glass face of my smartwatch, I activated the encrypted audio recording application. The device vibrated once against my skin, confirming that every single word of his extortion was being captured in high-definition audio. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to dig his own professional grave as deeply as humanly possible. "Is that your official legal strategy?" Terrence, I asked, keeping my tone completely flat and devoid of any fear. "Extorting your wife in a public hallway because you lack the intellectual skill to beat her in a courtroom. You are explicitly threatening to leverage your law firm's corporate resources to bankrupt a small business owner. That sounds like a remarkably fast track to an ethics investigation and automatic disbarment." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed sharply off the soaring marble columns of the lobby. "You think a family court judge is going to take the word of a failed wedding planner over a rising star at Caldwell and Associates? I am the golden boy of that firm. I bring in millions of dollars in billing. You are just collateral damage. I will destroy you, Maya. I am untouchable, and I will make sure you have absolutely nothing left by the time the sun goes down today." Before Terrence could continue his manic, self-incriminating tirade, the rhythmic, deliberate tapping of a wooden cane echoed across the polished floor. Harrison had returned from his phone call. He was a master of observation and an even better actor. Seeing Terrence cornering me against the wall, Harrison instantly adapted his physical demeanor to fit the exact stereotype Terrence would dismiss. He slouched his broad shoulders, shuffling his feet slightly, transforming himself into a frail, confused and highly vulnerable elderly man. He stepped right between me and Terrence, using his physical presence as a quiet but impenetrable shield. "Excuse me, young man," Harrison said, his voice trembling perfectly, feigning an apologetic, harmless tone. "I believe you are in my colleague's personal space. I highly suggest you step back before security is required to intervene and escort you from the premises." Terrence dropped my arm in sheer disgust, turning his fury onto the elderly man, daring to interrupt his performance. Terrence looked Harrison up and down, taking in the vintage tweed suit, the polished wooden cane, and the silver hair. Blinded by his own narcissism, Terrence saw nothing but weakness. He saw a target he could easily bulldoze, entirely missing the sharp, calculating intelligence burning in the older man's dark eyes. "Get out of my way, old-timer," Terrence snarled, stepping aggressively toward Harrison, puffing out his chest to assert physical dominance. "This is a private legal conversation between a husband and his soon-to-be destitute wife. I do not know what discount senior citizen center she dragged you out of, but you have no business being here. Go find a bench to sit on before you break a hip and force me to sue you for loitering in a municipal building." Brenda let out a sharp, mocking laugh from her spot near the stairs, thoroughly enjoying watching her son berate a senior citizen. Chloe giggled beside her, completely lacking the self-awareness to realize they were witnessing a monumental catastrophe in the making. Terrence felt completely validated by their audience, his ego swelling to dangerous new heights. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" Terrence continued, jabbing a finger toward Harrison's chest, stopping just an inch from the tweed fabric. I am a junior partner at the most powerful law firm in this entire city. I have judges on speed dial. I could ruin the rest of your miserable life with one phone call. Step aside right now and let me finish dealing with my wife. I watched the interaction unfold, my finger still hovering near the face of my smartwatch, capturing every single threat and ethical violation. Terrence was writing a masterclass on how to destroy a legal career in under 3 minutes, and he had absolutely no idea who he was threatening. He was blindly throwing the weight of Caldwell and Associates at the very man who had built that exact firm from the ground up. Harrison did not flinch. He did not step back. The frail, shuffling elderly man persona vanished in a fraction of a second. Harrison straightened his spine, pulling himself up to his full, imposing height. The air around us seemed to drop 10 degrees. The shift in his energy was magnificent and terrifying. He looked at Terrence with eyes that had seen decades of brilliant, ruthless litigation and federal court battles. It was the look of an apex predator, analyzing a very slow, very stupid prey that had just wandered into its hunting ground. Harrison rested both hands firmly on the smooth head of his wooden cane. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell or match Terrence's frantic energy. He spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that cut through the humid Georgia air like a serrated blade. I hope you argue better in front of a judge than you do in a hallway, son. Before Terrence could even muster a response to the devastatingly calm insult, the heavy brass-handled oak doors of the courtroom swung open with a loud, reverberating crack. The bailiff stepped out into the hallway holding a thick clipboard, officially calling our case number to the floor. The time for hallway threats was over. The execution was about to begin. I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, leaving the suffocating heat and the chaotic energy of the hallway completely behind me. The air inside was sterile, severely chilled, and heavy with the scent of polished wood and legal precedent. I walked deliberately toward the defense table, my heels striking the floor in a steady, measured rhythm. I took my seat with the perfectly straight posture of a woman who was not arriving for a slaughter, but for an execution she had meticulously planned. Across the center aisle, Terrence was already holding court at the plaintiff's table. He leaned back in his leather chair, exuding a toxic, overflowing confidence. Next to him sat a slick, high-priced attorney whose custom-tailored suit and perfectly manicured hands screamed exorbitant hourly rates and ruthless tactics. Terrence looked over at me, sitting there completely alone at the large defense table. His arrogant smirk deepened his eyes, lighting up with a predatory thrill. I thought my solitude was a white flag of surrender. He genuinely believed that I had walked into this legal battleground entirely unprotected, ready to be carved up and discarded. He had no idea my isolation was merely the quiet before the storm. The bailiff called the room to order, his voice echoing sharply off the high ceilings, and the judge took his seat at the elevated bench. I was an older, stern-looking man with sharp eyes and a reputation throughout Atlanta for suffering zero fools in his courtroom. He ran a tight, unforgiving docket, and Terrence clearly thought he could manipulate that efficiency to push through a rapid, devastating judgment. Terrence's attorney did not waste a single second of the court's time. He stood up immediately, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced theatrical flair, and confidently approached the bench. He carried a thick, neatly bound stack of financial affidavits. "Your Honor," the attorney began, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced condescension. "We are filing an emergency motion for a summary judgment today. My client, Mr. Terrence, is the sole financial provider for this household and the primary breadwinner by an astronomical margin. We have provided the court with comprehensive financial disclosures, proving unequivocally that the defendant has contributed absolutely zero capital to the marital assets over the duration of their marriage. Therefore, we respectfully request that the court deny any and all claims for spousal support, asset division, or property rights, as the defendant's alleged business venture is nothing more than a highly unprofitable amateur hobby." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded gracefully on the polished surface of the defense table. I did not flinch. I did not display a single ounce of outrage. I knew exactly what those neatly bound pages contained. Terrence had deliberately submitted heavily redacted, entirely forged financial documents under the guise of transparency. He had aggressively erased my income, artificially inflated his own debts, and completely hidden the millions in offshore accounts. He was currently washing through his brother Jamal's failing commercial real estate venture. He had constructed a massive, legally binding lie, and he was betting everything on the assumption that a supposedly uneducated woman from the South Side would never possess the financial literacy to challenge it. The judge adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses, taking the heavy folder from the bailiff. The entire courtroom fell into a tense, suffocating silence as he slowly flipped through the pages. I watched the judge's brow furrow. I watched his eyes narrow as he studied the blatant misrepresentations and the aggressive lack of spousal allocation. He was a seasoned professional, and while he might not have immediately spotted the offshore laundering, the sheer inequity of the proposed settlement clearly gave him pause. The judge lowered the documents to his desk and looked over the top of his glasses. His stern gaze landed squarely on me. Mrs. Maya, the judge, said, his tone a complex mixture of strict legal formality and underlying unwanted pity. I see you are sitting at the defense table entirely by yourself this morning. This is a highly complex financial motion. Your husband has submitted one that carries severe permanent consequences for your future. Do you have legal representation today, or are you proceeding pro se? Before I could even draw a breath to deliver my response, Terence laughed. It was not a quiet, polite chuckle. It was an audible, deeply mocking laugh that cut through the quiet dignity of the courtroom like a jagged knife. Terence leaned over to his slick attorney, covering his mouth with one hand, but intentionally projecting his voice loudly enough for the court reporter, the bailiff, and the judge to catch every single humiliating word. She cannot even afford a basic paralegal, let alone a real attorney. Terence whispered loudly, shaking his head in mock sympathy. She is probably going to ask the court to validate her party planning receipts from last year to prove she bought groceries. It is pathetic. We should just wrap this up before she wastes the court's entire morning. The slick attorney smirked, nodding in agreement as he organized his pens, completely confident that the battle was already won. They were reveling in my supposed humiliation, drinking in the power dynamic they believed they had perfectly orchestrated. I did not react to his vile insult. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the judge, my expression completely serene. I opened my mouth to address the bench to politely inform the court that I would not be proceeding alone. But the words were completely unnecessary. A loud, heavy groan of ancient wood suddenly echoed from the very back of the room. The massive double doors of the courtroom swung open with a slow, undeniable force that commanded instant attention from every single person present. The rhythmic, distinct sound of a solid wooden cane striking the hardwood floor broke the silence of the room. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was unhurried, dripping with a quiet, lethal authority. The gallery went dead silent. The court reporter paused her typing. Terence's attorney stopped smirking, his head swiveling toward the center aisle. I did not need to look back, because I already knew exactly who was walking down that aisle. Harrison moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his physical presence instantly dominating the very oxygen in the room. He was no longer the frail, asthmatic passenger from the airplane, nor the confused, elderly man from the lobby. He was an apex predator stepping back onto his most familiar hunting ground. The judge looked up from the forged financial documents. The mild annoyance on his face vanished in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. The color completely drained from the judge's weathered face, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. He dropped the paperwork flat onto his wooden desk and immediately pushed his chair back. Without a single moment of hesitation, the judge stood to his feet, smoothing his black robes with visibly trembling hands. Justice Caldwell, the judge said, his voice ringing across the silent courtroom, with absolute breathless reverence. What an honor. Terence slowly turned his head. The smug, victorious smirk that had been plastered across his face for the last 6 months instantly melted away. It was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The expensive gold fountain he had been twirling between his fingers slipped from his grasp. It clattered loudly against the polished hardwood floor and rolled away under the plaintiff table. His broad shoulders slumped and the rich color drained completely from his face, leaving a sickly ashen hue behind. I watched his chest stop moving as he became entirely paralyzed by the reality standing in the center aisle. For the entirety of our marriage, Terence had worshipped one singular entity above all else. He was fiercely devoted to Caldwell and Associates. It was the most prestigious and highly respected corporate law firm in the Southeast. It was a legal powerhouse that dictated the business landscape of Atlanta and shielded the wealthiest families in the state. Terence had sacrificed our anniversaries, my birthdays, and any semblance of a healthy partnership to grind his way up the corporate ladder at that exact firm. He practically prayed at the altar of the founding senior partner. That man was a legendary figure whose name was etched in solid gold lettering on the glass doors of Terence's office building. He was a man who had broken monumental barriers in the federal courts decades before Terence even passed the bar exam. That man was Harrison Caldwell. Terence had spent years desperately begging for a junior partnership. He attended every single firm gala and kissed up to the executive committee at every opportunity. He played the role of the flawless high society legal prodigy to absolute perfection. He had even brought his elitist mother Brenda to firm dinners just to show off his proximity to such elite power. Brenda loved to brag to her country club friends about her son rubbing shoulders with the Caldwell family. And now the very architect of his entire career, the ultimate gatekeeper of his financial future, was walking down the center aisle of family court. Harrison tapped his wooden cane with a slow, deliberate rhythm that sounded like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of Terence's professional life. The slick, high-priced attorney sitting next to Terence suddenly seemed to realize exactly who had just entered the room. The lawyer abruptly stood up and nearly knocked his heavy leather chair backward. He hurriedly buttoned his suit jacket. His previous arrogance was entirely erased by a sudden frantic need to show respect to a legal titan. The entire plaintiff table was practically vibrating with panic. Terence tried to speak. He opened his mouth to force out a respectful greeting or a desperate explanation, but his throat bobbed uselessly. He was a man watching a tidal wave approach, while his feet were cemented to the ground. He was completely stripped of his arrogant defenses. Behind them in the gallery seating, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from Brenda. She recognized Harrison immediately. She knew exactly who he was and what his presence meant. The smug satisfaction she had worn while waiting for my financial ruin vanished. I could hear Chloe shifting uncomfortably in the wooden pew next to her mother-in-law. Chloe whispered a confused question, but Brenda fiercely shushed her. The power dynamic in the room had flipped so violently that the shockwave knocked the breath out of my husband and his toxic family. Harrison ignored all of them. He did not even glance in Terence's direction as he walked past their table. He kept his dark eyes locked firmly on the judge. He projected a commanding aura that effortlessly filled every corner of the sterile courtroom. He reached the wooden gate separating the gallery from the court floor, unlatched it smoothly, and walked directly toward my defense table. The judge remained standing behind his elevated bench. His posture was rigid with absolute deference. It was a stunning reversal of authority. Just moments ago, this judge had looked at me with thinly veiled pity, ready to process my financial destruction as just another routine docket number. Now he was addressing the man walking toward me with the kind of reverence typically reserved for royalty. Harrison pulled out the heavy wooden chair next to mine and took his seat. He placed his vintage leather carry-on bag onto the table with a solid thud. He turned to me and offered a warm, reassuring nod before shifting his attention back to the bench. He did not look like a frail passenger recovering from a turbulent flight. He looked like an apex predator who had just locked the doors to the hunting ground. "Your Honor," Harrison said. His voice boomed with a rich, resonant authority that commanded absolute silence across the room. "I apologize for my slightly delayed arrival this morning. The Atlanta traffic remains as unforgiving as ever. I am acting as co-counsel for this brilliant young woman today. I will be taking the lead on all financial disputes regarding the dissolution of this marriage." The judge swallowed hard and nodded quickly, leaning forward over his bench. "Of course, Justice Caldwell. The court fully recognizes your appearance on behalf of the defense. We were just reviewing the plaintiff's emergency motion for summary judgment regarding the allocation of marital assets." I heard Terence let out a sharp, ragged exhale from across the aisle. I looked over and saw him leaning toward his attorney. He was whispering frantically, and his hands were gesturing in wild, desperate motions. His slick lawyer was shaking his head rapidly, looking pale and completely terrified of the situation. Terrence knew exactly what was about to happen. He knew that the fraudulent, heavily redacted documents he had just submitted were sitting right in front of the sharpest legal mind in the state of Georgia. He had built a massive lie, assuming I would be sitting here alone and defenseless. He had never prepared for his own boss to show up and audit his perjury. I sat perfectly still beside Harrison, keeping my hands folded gracefully on the table. A profound sense of vindication rushed through my veins. Terrence had spent our entire marriage trying to make me feel small. He had constantly reminded me of my Southside roots and told me that I did not belong in rooms where high-level decisions were made. He had threatened to bankrupt my business and destroy my livelihood just 20 minutes ago in the hallway. Now he was sitting entirely trapped in a room he thought he controlled, facing the total annihilation of his own career. Submitting false financial disclosures in a family court proceeding was a severe violation. Doing it in front of the founding partner of your own law firm was career suicide. Terrence had knowingly hidden over $2 million in offshore accounts through his brother's failing commercial real estate venture. He had manipulated the numbers to erase my contribution to our household and inflate his own worth. If Harrison exposed this perjury on the official court record, Terrence would not just lose his junior partnership. He would be reported to the state ethics board and stripped of his license to practice law entirely. Harrison reached into his leather bag and pulled out a pair of classic reading glasses. He slipped them on with methodical precision. He intentionally let the tension in the room stretch until it felt like the air itself was snapping. He then reached out and picked up the exact copy of the financial affidavits Terrence's lawyer had just proudly handed to the clerk. Harrison held the heavy stack of paper in his hands, feeling its weight and assessing its contents. He let the documents drop back onto the table with a loud, dismissive smack that made Terrence physically jump in his seat. Harrison leaned forward and rested his elbows on the polished wood of the defense table. He looked directly across the center aisle and locked eyes with Terrence. Terrence physically recoiled. He pressed his back flat against his chair as if trying to merge with the upholstery to escape the searing judgment of his superior. Harrison did not raise his voice to a shout. He did not need to. The quiet, cold menace in his tone carried perfectly across the completely silent courtroom, striking Terrence right in the chest. Now, Harrison said, removing his glasses and placing them neatly on top of the forged paperwork. Let us discuss the fraudulent financials Mr. Terrence just submitted to this court under penalty of perjury, shall we? The slick attorney sitting next to Terrence jumped up so fast, his heavy leather chair scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor. The man looked as if he had just been struck by lightning. The arrogant swagger he carried into the courtroom had completely evaporated, replaced by a frantic, breathless panic. He hastily buttoned his custom suit jacket, his hands visibly shaking as he looked from the judge to Harrison and then down at the documents he had just submitted. "Your Honor," the attorney stammered, his previously smooth voice cracking down the middle. "There appears to have been a catastrophic clerical error on the part of my legal team. The financial affidavits we just submitted to the clerk were early incomplete draft copies. We formally request an immediate withdrawal of those documents from the official record pending a thorough review." Howe was desperately trying to save his own license to practice law. He was trying to build a firewall between himself and the perjury his client had just committed. But Harrison did not even look at the panicked lawyer. Harrison kept his dark, piercing eyes locked entirely on Terrence, who was sitting frozen in his chair, sweating profusely through his bespoke navy suit. "You do not get to withdraw a lie simply because you were caught telling it," Harrison said, his voice ringing across the silent courtroom with devastating authority. Harrison reached into his vintage leather carry-on bag and pulled out a thick, heavily tabbed binder. He placed it squarely on our defense table. The loud thud of the binder hitting the wood sounded like a death knell for Terrence's career. Harrison opened the cover and began distributing certified copies of the documents to the bailiff, who immediately walked them up to the judge. What the plaintiff failed to include in his fraudulent summary, Harrison stated clearly, are the subpoenaed banking records from the last 12 months. Documents that outline a highly systematic, deliberate funneling of marital assets. My client, Mrs. Maya, independently ordered a forensic financial audit when she noticed irregularities in her joint accounts. The findings are staggering. The judge put on his reading glasses and opened the binder. I watched the judge's eyes widen as he scanned the first page. Mr. Terrence has illegally siphoned $2.4 million from accounts shared with his wife. Harrison continued his tone, surgical and cold. He executed these transfers in increments purposefully designed to avoid standard banking flags. He then routed this capital into a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Terrence gripped the edge of his table. His knuckles turned completely white. He opened his mouth to object, but no sound came out. He was watching his entire life burn to the ground in real time. But the arrogance of the plaintiff did not stop at offshore hiding, Harrison added, turning a page in his own binder. He then washed these stolen marital funds by filtering them back into the United States under the guise of private consulting fees. He paid these exorbitant fees directly to a failing commercial real estate development firm, a firm solely owned and operated by his brother Jamal. The sound of Jamal's name being entered into the federal court record sent a shockwave through the gallery behind us. I did not turn around, but I could hear the sharp, frantic intake of breath from Chloe. Her entire designer lifestyle was built on the foundation of Jamal's real estate business. Knowing that her luxury cars and country club memberships were being funded by money stolen from my bank accounts was a reality she was completely unequipped to handle. "This is an egregious violation of fiduciary duty," Harrison declared, looking up at the judge. "It is money laundering, it is asset concealment, and by submitting those initial affidavits today, it is perjury of the highest order." Suddenly, the heavy wooden pews in the gallery creaked loudly. Brenda shot up to her feet. She could not stand it. She could not sit in silence and watch the golden child she had placed on a pedestal be dismantled and exposed as a common criminal. The meticulously crafted high society image she valued above her own life was being shredded in front of a sitting judge and the founding partner of Atlanta's most elite law firm. "That is a lie!" Brenda screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and echoing wildly across the courtroom. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my back. "You are setting him up. My son is a brilliant attorney. He is a good man from a respectable family. Maya is the one manipulating the money. She is a gold digger from the South Side trying to steal our family legacy because she could never earn a dime on her own. She is framing my son." The eruption of pure elitist venom broke the solemn decorum of the room. Brenda truly believed her status gave her the right to interrupt a legal proceeding to protect her bloodline. She was dead wrong. The judge snatched his wooden gavel and slammed it down against the sounding block with an explosive, deafening crack. "Order in my court!" The judge roared, his voice booming with absolute fury. "Ma'am, you will sit down and remain completely silent this instant, or I will have the bailiffs place you in handcuffs for contempt of court. You will spend the entire weekend sitting in a holding cell. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Brenda froze. The threat of being handcuffed and dragged into a local jail cell instantly shattered her entitled outburst. She sank back down into the wooden pew, her face pale and her chest heaving with panicked breaths. Chloe grabbed her mother-in-law's arm, looking terrified that they were both about to be arrested. The judge took a deep breath, composing his judicial authority before turning a glaring, furious gaze down at Terrence. "Mr. Terrence," the judge said, his voice dangerously low, "I am currently looking at certified bank routing numbers that directly contradict the sworn affidavit you handed my clerk 5 minutes ago. Do you have any explanation for this discrepancy before I contact the State Ethics Board and have your license to practice law suspended immediately?" Terrence was completely drowning. The slick attorney sitting next to him had physically leaned his chair away, putting as much distance between himself and his radioactive client as possible. Terrence looked at the judge, then at Harrison, and finally his wild, desperate eyes landed on me. He realized his legal arguments were destroyed. He realized his financial crimes were exposed. He had absolutely no logical defense left, so he resorted to the only tactic he knew. He tried to destroy my character. He desperately needed to shift the narrative back to his favorite fiction. He needed the judge to believe I was a worthless dependent. "She contributes absolutely nothing to our marriage." Terrence shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria as he pointed a shaking finger at me. He completely abandoned his polished legal vocabulary, resorting to frantic, desperate insults. "You cannot trust these documents, Your Honor. She is an unemployed leech. Her little event planning hustle went bankrupt months ago. She has no clients and no income. I am the only one bringing in money to support us. I work 80-hour weeks at my firm, while she sits at home doing nothing. She is completely dependent on me. She fabricated these audits because she knows she is about to be out on the street." Terrence was breathing heavily, sweat dripping down his forehead, staring at the judge as if his pathetic outburst would magically erase the mountain of evidence sitting on the bench. He thought reducing me to a failed party planner would somehow justify his financial crimes. I was gripping the edges of his table, a drowning man clinging to a rotting piece of driftwood. I did not react to his screaming. I did not defend my work ethic or justify my existence. I just looked at him with a calm, clinical pity. Harrison did not object to the outburst. He did not interrupt Terrence's manic rant. He simply let the desperate, pathetic echoes of my husband's lies fade into the high ceilings of the courtroom. Harrison reached out and gently closed his thick binder of evidence. He turned his head and looked at me, a brilliant, anticipatory light shining in his dark eyes. He leaned back in his heavy wooden chair and casually steepled his fingers. "Maya," Harrison said, his voice smooth and carrying perfectly across the silent room, "I believe it is time to show them your portfolio." I stood up slowly, making sure every eye in that courtroom was locked on me. The heavy silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Terrence was still gripping the edge of his table, his chest heaving from his manic outburst, expecting me to pull out a handful of glittery wedding invitations or cheap catering invoices to prove my meager existence. He wanted me to scramble. He wanted me to cry and beg the judge to validate my small, insignificant life. I did not give him that satisfaction. I reached down and unsnapped the twin brass locks on my leather briefcase. The crisp click echoed sharply across the room. I reached inside, bypassing the settlement papers he had tried to force on me in the hallway, and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in navy blue leather. I did not hand the judge a scrapbook of party planning receipts. I handed the bailiff my official corporate tax filings, my articles of incorporation, and my federal auditor credentials. The bailiff took the heavy binder, his eyebrows raising at the sheer weight of it, and carried it up to the bench. I pulled out an identical binder and handed it to Terrence's high-priced attorney, who took it with hesitant, trembling hands. I turned my body completely toward the plaintiff's table. I looked dead into Terrence's eyes. The frantic, wild desperation in his expression was a beautiful contrast to the absolute stillness in my own. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of a woman who was about to dismantle his entire reality brick by brick. "I do not plan parties, Terrence." The words hung in the air, freezing the blood in his veins. He blinked rapidly, unable to comprehend what I was saying. I placed my hands flat on the wooden table, leaning forward just enough to let him know there was no escape from what was coming. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Crisis Management. My firm audits, liquidates, and restructures failing corporations. I handle federal compliance violations and hostile boardroom takeovers. The late nights you spent mocking me, telling your mother I was probably in the garage folding napkins and tying ribbons for cheap brides, I was actually on encrypted conference calls with international banking regulators." Terrence looked as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked down at the binder his slick attorney had just opened. The lawyer turned the first page, and I watched the exact moment the man's soul left his body. He was looking at my certified corporate tax returns. He was looking at an 8-figure gross annual revenue. He was looking at the irrefutable federally documented proof that the woman sitting across from him was not an unemployed leech. She was a corporate titan who made his junior partner's salary look like pocket change. "Your Honor," I said, directing my attention back to the judge, who was currently reading through my credentials with absolute fascination. "As you can see from the certified filings, I am not a financial dependent. I am the sole owner of a multi-million-dollar crisis management firm. I have never relied on Mr. Terrence for a single dime of my livelihood. In fact, while he was busy siphoning our joint marital funds to pay for his brother Jamal's failing real estate leases and to buy emerald green designer dresses for his mistress. My personal wealth was securely locked away in a blind corporate trust that he lacked the security clearance to even discover. A loud, sharp gasp echoed from the gallery behind me. It was Brenda. For 3 years, that woman had paraded me around her country club friends as her son's charity case. She used to offer me her old, outdated designer coats out of pure pity, loudly claiming that she wanted me to look presentable when I attended her neighborhood garden parties. She had constantly reminded me that paying off my mother's medical debt was the only reason I had a roof over my head. Now she was sitting in a hard wooden pew, realizing she had been playing a pathetic game of pretend wealth while the woman she abused was quietly running a financial empire. Terrence grabbed the binder from his attorney, his hands shaking so violently the thick pages rattled. He stared at the numbers. He stared at the federal seals. The confusion on his face rapidly morphed into sheer, unadulterated horror. He was a man waking up from a deeply arrogant dream, only to find himself standing on a landmine. "This is impossible," Terrence stammered, his voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch. "This is a complete fabrication. She works from home. She takes client calls in her pajamas. She does not own a corporate auditing firm. This is a fraud." The judge looked down at Terrence with a gaze so cold it could have frozen boiling water. "Mr. Terrence," the judge warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "These documents contain certified federal auditor credentials and verified Internal Revenue filings. Are you officially accusing your wife of submitting forged federal documents to this court right after you were just caught submitting falsified bank records? Because if you are, I will gladly invite the Federal Bureau of Investigation into this courtroom right now to settle the matter." Terrence snapped his mouth shut. His slick attorney violently grabbed his arm, pulling him back down into his chair and furiously whispering in his ear to stop talking before he ended up in a federal penitentiary. Terrence was completely trapped. The narrative he had sold to his mother, to Chloe, and to his new Harvard-educated girlfriend had just been incinerated. He was not the powerful, magnanimous breadwinner carrying a dead-weight wife. How was a financially illiterate junior employee who had just attempted to defraud a woman who literally dismantled fraudulent executives for a living? Harrison sat quietly beside me, a look of profound, quiet satisfaction resting on his face. He did not need to interject. He had set the stage perfectly, and he was thoroughly enjoying watching me execute the final blow. I turned my attention entirely back to Terrence. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. I could see the rapid, erratic pulse jumping in his neck. He was desperate for a way out, desperate for a loophole that would restore his fragile ego and put him back in control. But I was not finished. I had one more piece of evidence to introduce, and it was the one that would permanently sever his lifeline to the elite Atlanta society he worshipped. I leaned across the defense table, closing the physical distance between us. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. "You have been exceptionally busy this past month, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice low, steady, and devastatingly clear. "You bragged to your mother at Sunday dinner about landing the multi-million-dollar Vanguard corporate merger for Caldwell and Associates. You told Chloe that securing that specific merger was going to guarantee your senior partnership by the end of the fiscal year. You built your entire legal identity around the fact that you were the golden boy managing the Vanguard account." Terrence blinked, his chest heaving. The sudden shift in topic threw him off balance. He nodded slowly, a confused, desperate defense mechanism kicking in. "That is right," he breathed out, gripping the edge of his table. "I brought that account to the firm. I am the lead counsel on that merger. You cannot touch that. That is my deal." I offered him a smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. I reached back into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single crisp folder bearing the Vanguard corporate logo. I handed it directly to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "What you did not know, Terrence," I continued, letting every single syllable land with maximum impact, "is that Vanguard is undergoing a massive internal restructuring. Their board of directors recently fired their entire internal compliance team due to extreme negligence. To ensure their upcoming merger with Caldwell and Associates was legally bulletproof, Vanguard hired an external independent agency to thoroughly vet the legal teams assigned to their account. They needed an agency to conduct deep background checks on every single lawyer touching their financial data to ensure there were no liabilities, no hidden debts, and absolutely no ethical violations. The blood completely drained from Terrence's face. He stopped breathing. The slick attorney next to him slowly put his face in his hands, realizing the monumental catastrophe that had just unfolded. In the gallery behind me, the rustling and whispering completely ceased. I stared directly into the terrified, hollow eyes of the man who had spit on my working-class roots. "Vanguard hired my agency," I said softly. "I am the lead auditor assigned to their corporate merger. I am the one who holds the final binding signature on your contract." The absolute silence that fell over the courtroom was heavy enough to crush bone. My words hung in the chilled air, sealing the doors, the windows, and every possible escape route Terrence thought he had. I watched the blood drain completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw hung slack. He blinked rapidly, his mind desperately trying to reject the reality crashing down on him. The woman he had spent 3 years mocking, the woman whose working-class background he had used as a punchline at his elite country club dinners, was not just a successful executive. I was the gatekeeper to the exact corporate empire he worshipped. The slick, high-priced attorney sitting next to Terrence did something that spoke volumes. He physically pushed his heavy leather chair away from my husband. The lawyer recognized a sinking ship when he saw one, and Terrence was currently a burning wreck plummeting to the bottom of the ocean. The attorney refused to even make eye contact with him, staring rigidly ahead at the judge, desperate to separate his own legal license from the radioactive perjury sitting right next to him. I did not break eye contact with Terrence. I let him drown in the silence for a few more seconds before I pulled a second document from the Vanguard folder. Vanguard requires absolute, unimpeachable ethical transparency from their outside counsel, I said, my voice carrying a smooth, surgical precision across the room. When a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate merges, they do not hand their federal compliance data over to junior partners who hide their assets in the Cayman Islands. They hire my crisis management firm to perform deep forensic background checks on every single lawyer assigned to the account. It is a standard risk assessment protocol, Terrence, and you failed it spectacularly. I handed the document to the bailiff, who immediately passed it up to the judge. The judge adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the official Vanguard letterhead with intense interest. "I discovered your offshore accounts 3 weeks ago during a routine vetting process for the merger." I continued, addressing both Terrence and the bench. "I tracked the capital you systematically siphoned from our joint marital accounts. I followed the money trail directly into your brother Jamal's failing commercial real estate firm. You thought you were a financial genius, laundering money through your family to leave your wife destitute. What you actually did was create a massive, undeniable paper trail of federal fraud, right before asking a Fortune 500 company to trust you with their proprietary data." Terrence gripped his hair, his elbows resting heavily on the plaintiff table. He was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. He finally understood the magnitude of his arrogance. He had not just tried to cheat me out of a fair divorce settlement. He had documented his own criminal behavior and handed it to the exact federal auditor hired to vet his firm. "Your Honor," I said, gesturing toward the document now resting in the judge's hands. "What you are looking at is the official risk assessment report I filed with the Vanguard Board of Directors yesterday morning. As the lead auditor, I formally flagged Mr. Terrence as a catastrophic liability. His willingness to commit perjury in a family court proceeding indicates a severe lack of ethical boundaries, making him a high-level risk for corporate espionage and financial manipulation." Terrence shook his head violently, looking frantically between me, his lawyer, and the judge. "Maya, stop," he choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "You cannot do this. You are ruining my life. You ruined your own life the moment you decided my existence was disposable," I replied coldly. "I simply provided the paperwork." I turned my attention to Harrison, who was sitting beside me with the serene, untouchable posture of a king watching a traitor meet the guillotine. I respectfully addressed the court one more time. Based on my findings, I exercised my executive authority under the Vanguard contract. I officially vetoed Caldwell and Associates from representing Vanguard in this merger effective immediately, for as long as this specific junior partner remains employed at your firm. I have frozen a $40 million legal contract because I refuse to allow a man who steals from his own family to manage federal assets. The impact of that statement hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Terrence had just cost his prestigious law firm a $40 million deal. He had embarrassed the entire executive committee, and he had done it in front of the founding senior partner. Terrence completely snapped. The polished, arrogant junior partner persona shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He abandoned all courtroom decorum, shoving his chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. He lunged away from his table, scrambling frantically across the center aisle toward our defense table. The bailiff immediately placed a hand on his holstered weapon, shouting for Terrence to step back, but Terrence ignored him. He fell to his knees right in front of Harrison, his expensive suit wrinkling against the hardwood floor. He was crying. Real panicked tears streamed down his face as he looked up at the elderly man he had mocked in the hallway just 30 minutes ago. "Justice Caldwell, please." Terrence begged, his voice high and hysterical. "Please, you have to listen to me. She is lying. She is a vindictive, bitter woman trying to ruin me because I am leaving her. I can fix this. I can call the Vanguard executives directly. I can salvage the account. Please do not let her do this to my career. I am your top earner. I belong at your firm." It was a pathetic, humiliating display. A man who had spent years parading his superiority, who had demanded, "I know my place," was now groveling on his knees, begging for professional mercy in front of a packed gallery. Harrison did not flinch. He did not pull back in surprise. He simply looked down at Terrence with an expression of utter, absolute disgust. Harrison reached out with one hand and slowly adjusted the cuff of his tweed jacket, dismissing Terrence's hysteria with the casual annoyance one might reserve for an insect. "You called me an old-timer in the hallway," Harrison said, his deep voice resonating with cold, heavy authority. "You threatened to use the power of my own law firm to bankrupt this brilliant woman. You assumed that your expensive suit and your junior title gave you the right to operate above the law. You are not a top earner, Terrence. You are a profound embarrassment to the legal profession." Harrison leaned slightly forward, his dark eyes locking onto the sobbing man on the floor. I do not employ liabilities, son. And I certainly do not employ fools who lack the basic intelligence to know when they have been thoroughly outsmarted." The judge slammed his gavel loudly, demanding order. "Bailiff, remove the plaintiff from the center aisle immediately," the judge commanded, his voice shaking with absolute fury. Before the bailiff could even grab Terrence by his tailored shoulders, a loud, shrill voice erupted from the gallery behind me. It was Chloe. She could not stand it. She could not sit in that wooden pew and watch the wealthy, powerful family she had married into be publicly dismantled by a black woman from the South Side. Chloe thrived on her proximity to the family's supposed generational wealth. Her entire identity was wrapped up in her perceived superiority, and she possessed exactly the kind of weaponized ignorance that compelled her to speak when she should have remained completely silent. She shot up from her seat, clutching her frayed designer bag, her face flushed with indignant rage. "You are a vicious, manipulative liar," Chloe screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You think you are so smart with your fake corporate documents, but we do not need you. We do not need your ghetto money or your stupid crisis management firm. Terrence does not need Caldwell and Associates." Brenda grabbed Chloe's arm, desperately trying to pull her daughter-in-law back down into the pew, but Chloe yanked her arm away, completely consumed by her own arrogant delusion. "My husband Jamal's commercial real estate company is booming," Chloe yelled, her voice echoing wildly across the courtroom. "We have our own generational wealth. Jamal and I will financially back Terrence ourselves. We will open a brand new firm for him. We are a prominent family in this city, and we do not need a dime from a woman who belongs at a catering hall. You are nothing to us, Maya. You are just jealous because I actually fit into this family and you never did." The sheer blinding audacity of her outburst hung heavy in the chilled air of the courtroom. The judge raised his gavel again, ready to hold her in contempt, but I raised my hand slightly silently, asking the bench for just one moment. I turned my chair around very slowly. I looked past Terrence, who was still kneeling on the floor, and locked my gaze directly onto Chloe's flushed, furious face. I did not blink. I felt a cold, brilliant smile touch the corners of my mouth. Chloe had just willingly walked right into the second trap I had set. She wanted to brag about her husband's booming real estate company. She wanted to throw her stolen wealth in my face and claim superiority. She had absolutely no idea that I was holding the deed to her entire life in my briefcase. My hand remained suspended in the air for just a fraction of a second. The judge, who had his gavel raised and ready to strike Chloe down for contempt of court, paused. He looked at me, seeing the absolute lethal calm radiating from my posture, and slowly lowered the wooden mallet. He yielded the floor entirely to me, allowing me to finish the execution my husband and his family had so desperately asked for. I turned my chair around very slowly. I looked past Terrence, who was still kneeling on the hardwood floor in a pathetic heap of ruined ambition, and locked my gaze directly onto Chloe. Her face was flushed with indignant rage. She was clinging to her designer handbag like a shield. Her chin jutted out in a spectacular display of weaponized privilege. She truly believed her proximity to Jamal's family name and his supposed commercial real estate empire made her untouchable. She thought she could scream at me in a federal building and face absolutely zero consequences. I felt a cold, brilliant smile touch the corners of my mouth. "I was hoping you would bring up Jamal's real estate venture, Chloe," I said. My voice was smooth, completely devoid of the hysteria she had just displayed, but it carried across the silent courtroom with the terrifying precision of a sniper. I turned back to my open leather briefcase. The crisp sound of my hand sliding past the Vanguard corporate files echoed loudly. I pulled out a second, significantly thicker folder. This one was bound in dark red leather. I stood up from the defense table and walked around it, taking a few measured steps toward the low wooden barricade that separated the gallery from the court floor. Chloe stood her ground for a moment, but as I drew closer, the sheer, undeniable force of my presence made her physically shrink back. "You love talking about your husband's booming commercial real estate company." I continued, my eyes tracking every micro-expression of panic that began to flicker across her pale face. "You love parading around Buckhead, attending charity galas, and telling everyone in your exclusive social circle how Jamal is the mastermind behind the city's newest luxury developments. You use that illusion of generational wealth to look down on women like me. You use it to issue your little microaggressions at family dinners, mocking my working-class background because you assume I am just a party planner who got lucky." I opened the red folder and pulled out a thick, certified legal document. I held it up so the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom illuminated the heavy county seals stamped across the bottom. "What you conveniently ignore, Chloe, is that Jamal's business is entirely a facade. It is built on a rotting foundation of toxic debt and financial fraud. His flagship project, the massive commercial plaza on Peachtree Street that houses his extravagant corporate headquarters, has been hemorrhaging money for 3 consecutive years. He severely over-leveraged the property to fund your luxury vacations and your designer wardrobe. He took out massive mezzanine loans he knew he could never repay, and he defaulted on his primary mortgage exactly 4 months ago. The bank repossessed the note immediately and bundled it as highly distressed commercial debt." Chloe's mouth fell open. The color began to drain rapidly from her cheeks, leaving her expensive, carefully applied makeup looking like a harsh, unnatural mask. Brenda, sitting right next to her, stared at the legal documents in my hand with wide, horrified eyes. The confident sneer had been completely wiped from Brenda's face. "My crisis management firm does not just audit failing corporations," I stated, making sure the judge and Terrence heard every single word. "We also operate a highly aggressive network of private equity shell companies. We acquire distressed commercial assets, liquidate the liabilities, and restructure them for maximum profit. 30 days ago, my acquisitions team purchased the distressed debt on Jamal's commercial plaza. We bought the entire note for pennies on the dollar directly from his desperate creditors." I took another step closer to the wooden gate. I looked directly into Chloe's terrified, shaking eyes. I let the silence stretch for one agonizing second before I delivered the lethal blow. "I am your landlord, Chloe. I own the building where your husband plays pretend CEO. I own the concrete underneath his custom Italian leather desk. Chloe gasped. It was a sharp, ragged sound that tore through the quiet courtroom. She gripped the wooden pew in front of her knuckles turning bone white as her knees began to buckle. And since your trust fund husband has not paid his rent in 90 consecutive days, I continued, my tone dropping into a surgical, merciless register. I had my real estate attorneys file a commercial eviction notice. The judge signed the order yesterday afternoon. At 8 o'clock this morning, while you were busy picking out which outdated Prada bag you wanted to bring to court to mock me. The Fulton County sheriffs arrived at Jamal's corporate headquarters. They cleared out his employees, they seized his assets to cover the outstanding debts, and they officially padlocked the glass doors of his business. I let the absolute devastation of my words settle over her. I watched her mind desperately try to reject the reality of her total financial ruin. Jamal's company is bankrupt, Chloe. You have absolutely no income. The money Terrence stole from my marital accounts and laundered through Jamal's firm was the only capital keeping your luxury lifestyle afloat for the last 6 months. They were paying off aggressive creditors with my money just to keep the lights on. And now I have seized all of it. You do not have generational wealth. You have generational debt, and you owe every single dime of it entirely to me. The psychological collapse was instantaneous and total. Chloe's legs gave out completely. She collapsed backward into the hard wooden pew, her hands flying up to cover her face. She began hyperventilating, her chest heaving violently as she gasped for air. The pristine, untouchable shield of her white privilege and her married into wealth status shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the entire gallery. She realized in a single crushing instant that the luxury cars, the country club memberships, and the sprawling suburban estate were gone. She was entirely destitute, and she had just publicly humiliated herself in front of the very woman who held her financial execution orders. Terrence, still kneeling on the courtroom floor behind me, buried his face in his hands and let out a loud, pathetic sob. He had dragged his entire family into a financial bloodbath, and I had just detonated the final explosive right in the middle of a federal building. But the destruction of their false empire was too much for one person in that room to bear. Brenda could not accept it. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of high society perfection. She had sacrificed every shred of her own humanity to claw her way to the top of Atlanta's social elite. She had relentlessly abused me to ensure I knew I was beneath her, demanding my submission to feed her own monumental insecurities. Watching her golden child son face disbarment, and her eldest son lose his entire commercial real estate business to the very woman she despised broke her mind completely. Brenda refused to accept defeat. The illusion of her supremacy was her oxygen, and I had just suffocated her. She let out a piercing, guttural scream that sounded like a wounded animal. She shoved past a hyperventilating Chloe, uncaring that she was trampling over her own daughter-in-law, and stormed down the aisle of the gallery. Her face was contorted with a blind, irrational rage. The heavy, expensive string of pearls around her neck snagged on the edge of the wooden pew and snapped. White beads scattered across the floor, bouncing and rolling away like tiny bones, but Brenda did not even notice. She charged toward the low wooden gate separating the gallery from the court floor, her eyes locked onto me with pure, unadulterated hatred. The white pearls from Brenda's snapped necklace continued to bounce and roll across the polished hardwood floor, scattering like the last remaining fragments of her shattered sanity. She hit the low wooden gate separating the gallery from the court floor with a heavy, violent thud. Her hands gripped the varnished wood so tightly, her knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. The immaculately curated high society matriarch who had terrorized me for 3 years was completely gone. In her place stood a frantic, hyperventilating woman whose entire identity was evaporating before her eyes. "You ungrateful trash!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed off the high ceilings of the courtroom. "You are trying to steal our legacy. We made you. We took you out of the gutter and gave you a respectable name. You are nothing but a gold-digging fraud trying to tear down a prominent family because you are jealous of what we have." I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch at her venom. I looked at the woman who had spent every Sunday dinner making sure I knew I was an unwelcome outsider in her elite world. I looked at the woman who had weaponized my working-class background and used my mother's medical emergencies to demand my absolute submission. I felt a surge of cold clinical satisfaction wash over my entire body. I walked back to the defense table and reached into my leather briefcase for the final time today. I bypassed the standard legal filings and pulled out a sleek black folder sealed with a heavy metal clasp. I turned around and walked deliberately toward the wooden gate where Brenda was currently foaming with rage. Harrison remained perfectly still at the defense table watching my execution of this family, with the quiet pride of a mentor, watching a masterclass in psychological warfare. Legacy. I asked, my voice dropping into a lethal quiet register that forced everyone in the room to hold their breath just to hear me. Let us talk about this magnificent legacy of yours, Brenda. I popped the metal clasp and pulled out a thick stack of certified bank transfers, wire receipts, and unredacted mortgage statements. I laid them flat on the smooth wooden railing of the gate directly under Brenda's trembling hands. For 3 years you have paraded around Atlanta acting like American royalty, I said, keeping my eyes locked dead onto hers. You bragged to your country club friends about your sprawling estate in Buckhead. You hosted lavish charity galas to prove your supreme social standing, and every single time I walked into your house, you made sure to remind me that you graciously paid off my mother's hospital bills to save my family from bankruptcy. You used that medical debt as a leash to humiliate me, demanding I bow my head to your generational wealth. Brenda glared at me, her chest heaving, trying to maintain her posture of absolute superiority. Yes, I paid those bills, she spat, her eyes wild and frantic. Because you were too poor to afford them. I offered her a smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. No, Brenda, you did not. I tapped my index finger against the top document resting on the wooden gate. 3 years ago, your late husband's massive estate ran completely dry. You had secretly squandered the remaining liquid assets trying to maintain a lifestyle you could no longer afford. The bank sent you a final notice of foreclosure on your Buckhead mansion. Your elite country club was 30 days away from revoking your membership for unpaid dues. You were entirely broke, Brenda. You were facing total, humiliating financial ruin, and you were too terrified of losing your social status to tell your sons the truth. Brenda froze. The angry flush in her cheeks instantly drained away, leaving her skin an unhealthy, chalky gray. She stared at the documents on the railing, her eyes darting frantically across the bold black numbers printed on the bank statements. You were crying in your study when I found the foreclosure notices. I continued, my voice steady and merciless. I could have let you lose everything. But I knew Terrence would drain our joint accounts to save your pride, so I handled the problem myself. I set up an anonymous blind trust using capital from my crisis management firm. For the last 36 months, that trust has been quietly paying your mortgage. It has been paying your property taxes. It has been paying your exorbitant country club dues. Brenda began to shake. Her hands hovered over the paperwork, terrified to touch it, terrified to confirm the reality crashing down on her. And those medical bills for my mother that you love to throw in my face? I asked, leaning slightly closer to the gate. I paid those too. I routed my own money through your personal checking account to make it look like a seamless transaction. I let you take the credit because your fragile ego needed to feel like a savior. I let you play the wealthy philanthropist while I secretly funded your entire existence. Brenda snatched the unredacted bank statements from the wooden railing. Her eyes scanned the routing numbers, the dates, and the massive wire transfers that had kept her out of bankruptcy court. She looked at the name of the holding company listed as the primary benefactor, and then she looked at the matching corporate seal printed on my federal auditor credentials sitting on the defense table. The psychological collapse was absolute. The realization that her entire elite lifestyle, her pristine social standing, and her arrogant supremacy were completely funded by the South Side girl she had relentlessly abused broke her mind. The illusion of her generational wealth evaporated into thin air. She was not a high society matriarch. She was a dependent living off the charity of the woman she despised. No, Brenda gasped, her voice barely a hollow whisper, as the papers slipped from her trembling fingers and fluttered to the floor. No, this is a trick. This is a forged lie. You are nothing. You are a nobody from the bottom of the city. "You are standing in a designer suit that I paid for, Brenda," I said coldly. "You are living in a mansion that I saved. You are nothing without my money. Your entire legacy is a complete fabrication funded by my success." The truth finally penetrated her denial. The overwhelming, crushing humiliation of being publicly exposed as a financial fraud in front of a federal judge, a founding senior partner, and a courtroom full of spectators sent Brenda into a state of total hysteria. She completely lost her grip on reality. She let out another blood-curdling scream, reaching across the wooden gate, with both hands trying to physically attack me. She swiped wildly at my face, her manicured nails clawing at the empty air as I effortlessly took a single step backward out of her reach. She thrashed against the barricade, screaming incoherent insults, demanding that Terrence do something, demanding that someone arrest me for ruining her life. The judge had seen enough. The deafening, explosive crack of his wooden gavel striking the sounding block echoed like a gunshot through the room. "Bailiffs," the judge roared, his face flushed with absolute judicial fury. "Detain that woman immediately. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus by a hysterical spectator. Place her in handcuffs and remove her from this room right now." Two heavily armed court bailiffs rushed down the center aisle. They grabbed Brenda by her arms, forcefully pulling her away from the wooden gate. She fought them wildly, kicking and screaming that she was a prominent member of Atlanta society, demanding they unhand her. The officers did not care about her country club memberships or her zip code. They swiftly twisted her arms behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around Brenda's wrists echoed brilliantly across the silent gallery. They dragged the screaming, thrashing matriarch up the center aisle toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. Chloe sat frozen in the pew, her hands covering her mouth in sheer terror, too paralyzed by her own impending eviction to even attempt to help her mother-in-law. Terrence was still kneeling on the hardwood floor near the plaintiff table. He watched the entire scene unfold with dead, hollow eyes. He watched the mother he idolized, the woman who had fueled his narcissism and demanded his ruthless ambition, being physically dragged out of a federal building in steel handcuffs. He watched the absolute destruction of his family name, his financial security, and his professional career, all happening in the span of 20 minutes. The weight of his total ruin finally crushed whatever was left of his spirit. Terrence slumped forward on the floor, his forehead resting against the cold, polished wood. His broad shoulders began to shake violently, as the reality of his situation shattered his mind completely. The heavy double doors slammed shut behind the bailiffs, cutting off Brenda's hysterical screaming. The sudden quiet in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. I looked down from the low wooden gate and watched the final remnants of my husband's arrogance evaporate into the chilled air. Terrence could not process the visual of his untouchable mother being hauled away in steel handcuffs. His brain simply short-circuited. His knees gave out beneath him. The loud, hollow thud of his kneecaps striking the polished hardwood floor echoed like a gunshot. He did not brace himself. He just collapsed into a pathetic, trembling heap right in the middle of the center aisle. The man who had spent 3 years demanding I shrink myself to accommodate his massive ego was now curled in on himself, reduced to a sobbing, hyperventilating mess. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees. His expensive bespoke navy suit dragged across the dusty floorboards, completely ruining the immaculate image he worshipped. He reached the edge of my defense table and grabbed the thick mahogany ledge with white-knuckled desperation. His chest heaved violently. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with thick, ugly tears. "Maya, please." The words tore from his throat in a ragged, high-pitched wheeze. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and wild with pure terror. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to withdraw those corporate documents. I will sign anything you want. I will give you the 20,000. I will give you 50,000. I will walk away and leave you the house. Just tell the judge this was a massive misunderstanding. Tell Justice Caldwell you made a mistake about the Vanguard merger. You cannot take my career away from me. It is all I have." I did not move a single muscle. I sat in my heavy wooden chair looking down at the man who had promised to bankrupt me just an hour ago in the hallway. Seeing that his financial offers were failing to generate even a flicker of sympathy in my eyes, Terrence pivoted. He resorted to the ultimate act of cowardice. He turned on his own blood. "It was not my idea," Terence cried out, his voice cracking loudly. He pointed a shaking finger toward the back doors, where his mother had just been dragged out, and then swung his hand to point directly at Chloe, who was still slumped in the gallery pew, paralyzed by her own financial ruin. "My mother made me do it. She told me we had to protect the family legacy. She found out Jamal's commercial real estate business was going under, and she panicked. She said if Jamal went bankrupt, the country club would find out, and the family name would be a laughingstock in Atlanta. Chloe begged me for the money. She cried and said she would lose her luxury cars and her house. They forced me to hide the marital assets to bail them out. I did not want to steal from you, Maya. I swear to God I did not want to do it. They manipulated me. They made me funnel your money to the Cayman Islands." A loud, strangled gasp came from the gallery. Chloe stared at Terence with wide, horrified eyes. The man she had just fiercely defended, the golden boy she had praised while mocking my working-class background, had just sold her out to a federal judge without a second thought. The entire toxic alliance of their family shattered right there in the courtroom. It was a spectacular display of spinelessness. For years, Terence had demanded absolute loyalty. He had weaponized the concept of family unity to excuse every single instance of disrespect. Brenda and Chloe hurled my way. He told me I was the problem because I did not understand how affluent families protected each other. Now faced with the total annihilation of his own status, he was offering his mother and his sister-in-law up for slaughter, hoping it would buy him a shred of mercy. I looked at the slick, high-priced attorney sitting at the plaintiff table. The lawyer was actively packing his briefcase, refusing to even look at the pathetic display unfolding on the floor. Terence was entirely alone. Terence reached his hand up over the edge of the table. His sweating, trembling fingers clamped down on my wrist. "Maya, we came from the same place," he begged, trying a new angle of manipulation. "We are both just trying to survive in this elite world. We are the same. Please save me." I looked down at his hand gripping my wrist. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no pity, just a cold, clinical detachment. I pulled my arm backward with a sharp, forceful motion, breaking his grip completely. "We were never the same," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, merciless register that cut through his frantic sobbing. "You spent your entire life running from your roots, pretending to be someone you are not. I used my roots to build an empire you could not even comprehend." Terence stared up at me, his mouth opening and closing as the reality of my rejection settled over him. "You stood in the hallway today and told me that failures do not belong in your world, Terence." I leaned slightly forward, making sure he heard every single syllable of his final judgment. "Welcome to mine." I turned my chair around, putting my back completely to my husband. I dismissed his entire existence, erasing him from my immediate reality. I faced the elevated bench, folding my hands neatly on top of the polished defense table. Harrison sat quietly beside me, radiating an aura of absolute approval. He had watched me execute a flawless surgical dismantling of a toxic predator, and he did not need to add a single word. The judge had been watching the scene unfold with a look of profound disgust etched deeply into his weathered features. He picked up his wooden gavel, gripping the handle tightly. The judge looked down at the sobbing man on the floor, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Mr. Terence," the judge said, his voice booming with a heavy, unforgiving judicial authority. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed such a blatant, egregious display of perjury, fraud, and moral cowardice. You walked into my courtroom and attempted to use the legal system as a weapon to financially execute your wife. You submitted heavily redacted, falsified documents under sworn oath. You knowingly concealed millions of dollars in offshore accounts, and you actively conspired to launder marital assets through failing commercial enterprises to evade judicial distribution. You are a disgrace to the legal profession, and you have made a mockery of this court." Terence buried his face in his hands, his sobbing echoing loudly against the hardwood floor. The judge did not pause. He did not offer an ounce of leniency. "Based on the irrefutable certified evidence presented by the defense, I am granting an immediate and total summary judgment in favor of Mrs. Maya." The judge read the terms with a rapid, devastating precision. "I hereby award the defendant 100% of the hidden capital located in the Cayman Island accounts. Furthermore, due to the intentional malicious financial abuse and the deliberate attempt to leave the defendant destitute, I am placing an immediate judicial lien on any and all of your future earnings. This lien will remain active until Mrs. Maya's legal fees, forensic auditing costs, and any remaining marital debts incurred by your fraudulent activity are paid in full. The judge raised his gavel high into the air. But we are not finished here today. I am officially striking your falsified affidavits from the civil record and transferring them directly to the district attorney's office. I am formally recommending you for an immediate criminal investigation for perjury and financial fraud. May God have mercy on your career, because this court certainly will not. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a violent, explosive crack. The echo of the judge's gavel had barely faded from the high ceilings before Harrison stood to his feet. He did not rush. He buttoned his vintage tweed jacket with the meticulous precision of a man who had spent 50 years dominating federal courtrooms. The entire gallery held its collective breath. Even the court reporter paused her rapid typing, her fingers hovering over the keys as she waited for the legendary founder of Caldwell and Associates to make his final statement on the official record. Your Honor, Harrison began, his deep baritone voice cutting through the lingering tension. I would like the official court record to reflect that Caldwell and Associates formally and unequivocally disavows any and all financial affidavits submitted by the plaintiff today. We will be launching an immediate internal forensic audit of all cases touched by Mr. Terrence during his tenure. Furthermore, my firm will fully cooperate with the district attorney and the state ethics board in their upcoming perjury investigations. We do not harbor criminals, and we certainly do not shield men who use the law to financially abuse their spouses. The judge nodded solemnly, instructing the clerk to mark the statement. It was the ultimate legal death sentence. Harrison was not just firing Terrence, he was permanently blacklisting him across the entire American legal system. By publicly announcing a firm-wide audit, Harrison guaranteed that no reputable law practice in the country would ever risk hiring Terrence again. The Golden Boy was officially a massive radioactive liability. Harrison slowly turned away from the bench and looked down at the pathetic figure still groveling on the hardwood floor. Terrence was a shattered shell of the arrogant junior partner who had strutted into the lobby an hour ago. His expensive, bespoke suit was wrinkled and stained with his own sweat and tears. He looked up at Harrison with bloodshot, pleading eyes, desperately hoping for a final shred of professional mercy from his idol. Terrence, Harrison said, his voice dropping into a register so cold it sent a shiver down my spine. You spent 3 years trying to prove you belonged in elite society by tearing down a brilliant, self-made woman. You thought wearing a $1,000 suit and carrying my firm's business card gave you the right to operate above the law. You brought profound shame to my firm, and you attempted to defraud a woman who possesses 10 times the intellect and integrity you could ever hope to achieve. Terrence opened his mouth to beg, his hands reaching weakly toward Harrison's polished cane, but Harrison stepped back in sheer disgust. Do not open your mouth, Harrison commanded. You are fired, effective immediately. As we speak, my head of corporate security is currently packing your corner office into cheap cardboard boxes. They will be left on the loading dock by the service elevator. You are permanently banned from the premises. If you ever attempt to step foot inside a Caldwell and Associates building again, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing. Now get out of my sight. The finality of the dismissal broke the last remaining thread of Terrence's sanity. The realization that his entire identity, his precious status, his wealth, and his elite social standing were gone forever, caused his brain to completely fracture. The polished, composed attorney vanished, replaced by a feral, cornered animal. Terrence let out a blood-curdling scream of pure hysteria. He scrambled up from the floor, his arms flailing wildly as he launched himself toward our defense table. He was not trying to attack me. He was trying to grab the Vanguard corporate files resting in front of me, desperately deluding himself into thinking that if he could just destroy the physical paperwork, he could somehow undo the nightmare. He thrashed across the polished wood, screaming that it was not fair that he was the victim, that I had set him up to steal his life. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I sat perfectly still and watched him self-destruct. The judge roared for order, frantically slamming his gavel. 2 heavily armed court bailiffs sprinted down the center aisle. They tackled Terrence before his frantic hands could even brush the edge of my briefcase. The physical impact knocked the wind out of him, but he continued to fight like a madman. He kicked and thrashed against the officers, sobbing uncontrollably, begging his slick attorney for help. But his high-priced lawyer had already packed his briefcase and was actively speedwalking toward the side exit, abandoning his disgraced client without a backward glance. "Get your hands off me!" Terrence shrieked as the bailiffs twisted his arms behind his back, hauling him roughly to his feet. "I am a partner. I am a prominent attorney. You cannot do this to me." "Maya, tell them to stop. Tell them I am your wife." I looked at his sweat-drenched, tear-stained face. I picked up my solid titanium black Centurion card from the table, sliding it gracefully back into my designer wallet. "I am not your wife, Terrence," I said, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of mercy. "I am your reckoning. Enjoy the loading dock." The bailiffs dragged him backward up the center aisle. His expensive leather shoes scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He fought them the entire way, his hysterical sobbing echoing off the high ceilings as they forced him toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. The gallery spectators, the few who had not fled during the chaos, watched in stunned silence as the former golden boy of Atlanta's legal scene was forcibly ejected like a common criminal. As the bailiffs shoved the heavy oak doors open to drag Terrence into the hallway, a chaotic symphony of screaming flooded into the quiet courtroom. It was not coming from Terrence. It was coming from the lobby. The doors remained propped open for a few seconds, offering me a crystal-clear auditory front-row seat to the absolute collapse of his toxic family. Without their shared hatred of me to unite them, and faced with total inescapable financial ruin, Brenda and Chloe had turned on each other like starving wolves. I heard Chloe screeching at the top of her lungs, her carefully curated Southern Belle persona completely shredded. She was screaming that Brenda had ruined her life. Chloe wailed that Brenda had forced Jamal to take out those massive predatory mezzanine loans just to pay for Brenda's lavish country club galas and her ridiculous high society charity dinners. Chloe sobbed that she was going to be homeless because her mother-in-law cared more about maintaining a fake, elite image than the survival of her own children. Brenda, who was apparently still handcuffed and waiting for transport in the holding area just outside the doors, shrieked right back. The matriarch was viciously shifting the blame, screaming that Chloe was a lazy, entitled gold digger who had bled Jamal dry with her endless demands for designer clothes and luxury vacations. Brenda yelled that if Chloe had not been so greedy, Terrence would never have needed to steal my money in the first place. They were viciously tearing each other to pieces, loudly broadcasting their fraud, their staggering debts, and their total social annihilation to every single clerk, lawyer, and security guard standing in the Fulton County Courthouse lobby. The pristine, untouchable facade of their generational wealth was burning to the ground in spectacular, humiliating fashion, and they were the ones eagerly pouring gasoline on the ashes. I sat back in my heavy wooden chair, listening to the beautiful, chaotic music of their mutual destruction until the heavy oak doors finally swung shut, sealing their screaming out in the hallway. I took a deep, cleansing breath. The suffocating weight I had carried for 3 long years was completely gone. I turned to Harrison, who was already packing his vintage leather bag, with a highly satisfied smile on his face, ready to walk out of this building and claim my empire. The sharp, explosive crack of the wooden gavel echoed through the cavernous space and then slowly faded into absolute silence. The bailiffs had dragged a thrashing, sobbing Terrence through the heavy oak doors, leaving the courtroom entirely empty, except for the judge, the court reporter, and the defense table. The judge offered Harrison a final respectful nod before turning on his heel and exiting to his chambers. I sat perfectly still for a moment, letting the sheer magnitude of the victory wash over me. The suffocating weight I had carried for 3 long years was completely gone. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the man who had just lost his entire world, because I knew exactly what he would have done to me if I had not been armed with my own financial empire. I reached down and picked up the dark red folder containing the commercial eviction notices for Jamal and Chloe. I placed it neatly inside my leather briefcase, right next to the Vanguard corporate audit and the certified bank transfers that had just sent my mother-in-law away in steel handcuffs. I snapped the twin brass locks of my briefcase shut. The crisp, metallic click felt like the closing of a vault. I turned to look at Harrison. He was meticulously returning his reading glasses to a velvet pouch inside his vintage leather carry-on bag. His movements were slow, methodical, and completely unbothered by the absolute carnage we had just orchestrated. We packed our belongings in a comfortable, victorious silence, sharing the profound, unspoken understanding of two professionals who had just executed a flawless surgical strike. "Shall we go?" Harrison asked, his voice a smooth, deep rumble of satisfaction. "The air in here has become remarkably stale." "We certainly shall," I replied, standing up and smoothing the skirt of my tailored suit. We walked shoulder to shoulder up the center aisle. The polished hardwood floor, which had just been the stage for my husband's pathetic groveling, now felt like a red carpet leading me directly toward my freedom. When I pushed open the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom, the chaotic energy of the hallway immediately hit us. The scene outside was a spectacular portrait of self-inflicted ruin. Down the corridor near the security checkpoint, two heavily armed officers were processing Brenda. The pristine high society matriarch was completely disheveled, her cream-colored pantsuit wrinkled, and her face stained with ruined makeup. She was no longer screaming. She was staring blankly at the marble wall, trapped in a state of catatonic shock, as the reality of her impending bankruptcy and criminal charges finally short-circuited her brain. A few feet away, Chloe was slumped against a wooden bench, sobbing hysterically into her phone. She was desperately trying to call Jamal, screaming into the receiver that the sheriffs had padlocked their real estate office and that they had absolutely no money left to pay the mortgage on their suburban estate. She looked up and made eye contact with me as I walked past. The sheer venom in her eyes had been entirely replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth as if to beg for mercy, but I simply kept walking. I did not break my stride. I did not offer her a single glance of acknowledgement. They were ghosts to me now, irrelevant background noise fading rapidly into the rearview mirror of my life. Harrison and I bypassed the elevators and took the grand marble staircase down to the main lobby. We stepped through the revolving glass doors and walked out into the bright, blinding Atlanta sun. The humid Georgia heat immediately wrapped around us, but for the first time in years, it did not feel oppressive. It felt warm and brilliantly alive. The frantic screaming of my former in-laws, the heavy, suffocating presence of their elitist expectations, and the toxic shadow of my marriage completely dissolved into the vibrant, bustling sounds of the downtown city streets. We stood at the base of the courthouse steps, waiting on the wide concrete plaza. Within seconds, my private chauffeured Maybach glided smoothly around the corner, its polished black exterior gleaming under the bright afternoon sun. The vehicle pulled up seamlessly to the curb, right where Terrence and his toxic welcoming committee had ambushed me just a few hours ago. The driver immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear door, standing at absolute attention. Before stepping inside, I turned to face the man who had turned a miserable flight into the most satisfying day of my professional life. Harrison leaned on his wooden cane, looking at the luxury vehicle, and then back at me with a brilliant, knowing smile. "I have negotiated billion-dollar mergers and handled hostile boardrooms across the globe," I said, keeping my voice steady and filled with genuine respect. "But I have to admit, Harrison, that was undoubtedly the most entertaining and satisfying courtroom experience of my entire life. Thank you for your exceptional counsel today." Harrison let out a rich, booming laugh that carried over the noise of the city traffic. He tipped his head slightly, tapping his cane against the pavement. "It was my absolute pleasure, Maya," he replied, his dark eyes shining with immense pride. "I spent decades building Caldwell and Associates to be a fortress of integrity. Watching you ruthlessly expose a parasite who tried to use my firm to abuse a brilliant black woman was a profound privilege. You do not need a lawyer, my dear. You are a natural-born executioner." He stepped back, giving me room to enter the vehicle. He offered me one final wicked wink. "I will be sure to send the official billing department your way," he added, a playful edge returning to his authoritative tone. "Expect an exorbitant consulting invoice for my pro bono services today. I hear the chief executive officer of Apex Crisis Management is good for it." I smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached all the way to my eyes. "Send the invoice directly to my private office, Harrison. I will gladly authorize the payment. I stepped into the expansive, air-conditioned interior of the Maybach and settled deep into the plush leather seat. The heavy door closed with a solid sound, shutting out the heat and the noise of the city completely. The driver returned to the front seat and quietly informed me that we were cleared to head back to my corporate headquarters. As the luxury car slowly pulled away from the courthouse curb, I reached forward and opened the chilled compartment built into the center console. I pulled out a crystal flute and poured myself a glass of crisp, sparkling water. The condensation beaded perfectly against the cool glass. I took a slow, refreshing sip, letting the crisp liquid soothe my throat after a morning of verbal warfare. I turned my head and looked out the dark-tinted passenger window as we glided down the street. The heavy tint allowed me to see everything outside while remaining completely invisible to the world. That was when I saw him. Terrence was sitting on the dirty concrete curb near the service entrance of the courthouse. The bailiffs must have physically tossed him out the side doors after his hysterical outburst. He was completely alone. He had no briefcase, no phone, no slick attorney standing by his side, and absolutely no future. His bespoke navy suit was covered in dust and sweat. He was hunched over with his head buried deep in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the undeniable weight of his total annihilation. He had spent our entire marriage demanding that I know my place. He had tried to break my spirit, isolate me, and leave me destitute, because his fragile ego could not handle a woman who refused to shrink herself for his comfort. I wanted me to be a failure from the South Side who needed his charity just to survive. Instead, he had forced me to reveal that I was the predator who held the deed to his entire existence. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy as I watched his ruined figure fade into the distance. I felt nothing but absolute towering triumph. The toxic, heavy chains of his emotional abuse were shattered forever. I turned my gaze away from the broken man on the curb and looked forward through the windshield. The massive, glittering skyscrapers of the Atlanta skyline rose up before me, reflecting the limitless potential of the empire I had built with my own two hands. I took another sip of my sparkling water, reclining into the soft leather as the Maybach accelerated onto the highway. I was heading back to my multi-million-dollar company, back to a life where I dictated the terms and controlled the boardrooms. I was completely free, profoundly wealthy, and absolutely untouchable. The most devastating vengeance isn't a screaming match. It is the silent, strategic elevation of your own life. When arrogant partners or toxic relatives try to bury you, they forget you are a seed. True power comes from recognizing your worth and building an impenetrable fortress of independence. You owe zero loyalty to those who demand you shrink to fit their fragile egos. Walking away from a table where respect is no longer served isn't a defeat, it is your ultimate victory. Drop your survival story in the comments below. If you have ever had to cut ties with a toxic environment to protect your peace, hit that like and subscribe button for more fierce tales of women reclaiming their crown.